Okay, so that wasn't really what I envisioned for the first video, but it's good enough. Again, you guys should know what classes are and objects and that sort of thing, at least to some degree, so we won't like harp on that too much. We'll just talk about it as we go. So I'm going to add a new class to this project, and there's lots of different ways you can do it. What I tend to do, and what my brain likes for some reason, is to go up here to project and add class. I think you can also add an empty code file and then turn it into a class, but I think for what our purposes are, it's better just to do the add class thing. So this is called a product class. So do name, I don't think it's a rule like Java necessarily, but it's still a good practice. Give your file name right here where it says name. This is the name of the file that the class is stored in. Give it the same name as the name of the class, and it will, if you do that, if you actually call the file name product.cs for C#, I don't know if we've ever talked about that before, but that's what the extension is for, right? It will go ahead and name the class that too. So it's kind of like Java. Again, I don't think it's a strict rule. I think you can get around it if you want. I'm not sure about that actually, but this is the way you want to do it. You name the file product.cs, and it creates a file stored in product.cs file, which it creates a file that has a class specified. So you'll notice that it's in the namespace class demo. I think, I'm trying to remember about what it is by default. The book specifies that this is public. This is a lot. If you put public here, it allows you to use it outside of this particular file for sure. And I think outside of this particular form, other forms could create classes. Well, so it's not a form actually, by the way. It's just a class on its own, but you can use it in forms if it's public. So anyway, public class product. That's, so get aware of the syntax here. It's access specifier is optional, but I think I'm trying to remember by default if it's internal or private. I can't remember what the default is for this. Something to look up. It's something that doesn't really come up a lot, but until like you do more complicated stuff. Then you got keyword class. Then you got the name of the class, and then you have curly brackets that inside of which, now keep in mind, this is the namespace first of all. This is going to be the namespace for your whole project. So, you know, you can have another product class somewhere else inside of a different namespace if you want. You can use both of those products in one project if you specify using the namespace to distinguish between the two. For now, we can sort of kind of ignore that there's even a namespace because we don't really use it for any purpose, but just be aware that it's there, and that's the first structure here. You got all these using declarations up here, then you have the namespace, and then inside the namespace you have the definition for the class. So I would get in the habit of collapsing things when you're not using them, because it does get it, in my opinion, it gives you a feel for the overall structure. So you see when I collapse this, I'm collapsing the whole class definition. So you can see the 3 dots is saying that there's something you can uncollapse here. What are you uncollapsing? You're showing the entire definition of this class, which right now is nothing except, and this is very important, and it's something you're asked a lot about on exams and stuff that have to do with classes in C#, and Java's the same way in this regard. If you don't define a constructor, you do have a constructor. You have a constructor that's a default. Remember these words, maybe even write them down. So these words, a default default parameterless constructor. Default parameterless constructor. It's default because if you don't specify the constructor, it is the constructor you have by default. It's parameterless because you don't give it any arguments when you use this constructor that does exist, and it's a constructor. Which means that there is a bit of code in here that you can't see that's automatically implemented. It's invisible, in other words, to your eyes right now. That it's a method, a special kind of method that has no return value. And the name of the method is the same as the name of the class. So it's going to be product. And these are things I harp on when I teach Java. Like, memorize these things about constructors. It doesn't have a return value, not even void. And the name of the constructor is the same as the name of the class. That's another thing that's on exams all the time. What is the rule for a constructor in C Sharp? It's the same as the name of the class. This is not always true. This is true in Java. This is true in C Sharp. In VB, for instance, though, the name of a constructor for a class is new. It's just the word new, if I remember correctly. I think I do. So it's not always that rule, but for the most part, in object-oriented languages, the name of the constructor is the name of the class. So what does this mean? Let's see. First of all, once I've added this class, notice it's part of the project now. It's over here. And I didn't rename my form. I usually do that. And you notice, it still runs. So that I'm not doing anything with the class yet, but it is code. And if there were an error here, it wouldn't run. So for instance, if I forget a curly brace, I always forget to stop running these when I make changes sometimes. So you see I have build errors. It won't even build for me because it notices that in this entire project, there is a component of this project that I added called product.cs. It has a product class, a class called product in it. It will not build. So that's just to show you that it is part of the class. So my recommendation also for these things, when you're working on these projects, always keep your code in a running state as much as possible. You add the class to your project, you give it a name, you don't do any of the code for it yet. Just check and make sure it still runs. For goodness sake, please keep it's better for you and me, my mental health, if you keep your code in a running state and then you don't come to me with like a million errors because your code is a jumble. If you just do little incremental additions to your code and then check to make sure it still runs, it still builds, you have a lot less of a headache as things go. I know sometimes things get away from you and thoughts get away from you. You add a bunch of stuff. Try to avoid that tendency. Like write down all the stuff you need to add, but then like add it piece by piece. Anyway, what are we going to call this form? I guess we'll call it class demo. So always click yes when you rename like that. So and then you know what? Check and see if it runs. That's a big major step. A lot of things happen when you rename like that, when you refactor like that. Make sure it all worked correctly. Go ahead and run it and make sure it builds. All right. So this is a form, and we want to change the properties just, here. We might change this to something else later, but just for cosmetic purposes, we'll change what's in the title bar. So this is to get started. This is part one. All I've done so far, and because I talk so much and go on tangents, we haven't got a whole lot done, but we did get the first step, which is to add a code file to our project that holds a class in it called product. And then we talked a little bit about the parameterless constructor. Let me take 1 minute to show. I want to show that before we go on to the next step. So what does that mean? So let's say for this particular project, and this might change as we go, but for now I'm just going to go to the form load event, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to instantiate a product. How do you do that? Once you've added a product class to any kind of class to your project, you now have access to a data type so classes are data types. They're complex data types, just like int, double, bool, string, whatever, all the data types you're used to. You've created your own, it's sometimes called a user-defined data type. The user in this case is the programmer, not the end user, not the person you create the program for, like the accountant or the worker in HR that keeps the data employee rate. We're not talking about that user. We're talking about the user of C#, the user of Visual Studio. It's a user-defined data type. It's a complex data type. It has lots of parts to it. It's a reference data type because what the actual variable, what we do here, product, what this thing stores is an address of an object that you've created a product type. And usually we can kind of combine these two different steps into one, but I'm going to do them separately just to show that they are separate. I've declared a variable of product data type, of data type product. That's what I've done here. What is the value of it? I think reference types usually are null by default. It doesn't have a value. It doesn't have a memory address yet. To give it a memory address, you have to do this. Product gets new product. And this thing that I'm typing right now is the constructor. Specifically, it's that default parameterless constructor that exists over here, even if I don't define it. Oh, shoot, here it is. Imagine there's an invisible, let me show you what it looks like. It looks like this. It's public product, no parameters, so parameterless, and it's got an empty body, basically. That's what it would look like if you could see it. It would look something very similar to that, if not exactly like that. Now, here's the thing, and I'm just going to say this before I leave you for the next video. Now that I've created an explicit visible constructor, the parameter list does not exist anymore. So that constructor I was just talking about, and I'm saying this is what it would look like. Now that I've done this, I have actually created a constructor. So the invisible parameter list one does not exist. It is if you have one or more constructors that you define explicitly by typing something out, the default one is not there anymore. But because I define one that operates just like the other one, if you look at the code for it, I always get lost in getting back to the code here. It works the same way, so it doesn't affect the syntax here when you instantiate it. All right, so that's it for this video.